Hello, I'm Louis Meyers, and this is Meet the Author, where today we have with us from New York City, Mr. Clay Risen, who is a journalist, reporter at the New York Times. Mr. Risen is the author of this book that came out this year. It's called The Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. And also we're going to be talking about a somewhat older book, but can still be found, especially online. And this dealt with the riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King and the long-term social and political aftermath of that. Mr. Risen was named, by the way, this book was named Book of the Year by the New Yorker and the Chicago Tribune. Clay Risen is the author of several previous works on U.S. history, including The Crowded Hour about Theodore Roosevelt, also The Bill of the Century about the battle for the Civil Rights Act. He is a member of the Society of American Historians and lives in Brooklyn with his family. And we're so pleased to have him here.
No, thanks for having me.
Well, this book is not only talks about a fairly recent part of American history, but you know, as one famously said, if we don't learn from history, we're apt to repeat it. And as I read this book, and we'll talk about it during this hour, there are unfortunately echoes of our present circumstances, I believe. So it's important to look back at what happened during the McCarthy years and how it evolved and eventually how it ended. You said in the book, and I quote, just to set this up, quote, "The Red Scare was never only about government overreach into the political lives of its citizens. It was also about the fever that it touched off within everyday American life. To be labeled a communist was a social and career death sentence." So I thought the best way to look back would be to talk about some of the people who actually made the policies or were caught up in them or were involved with them. But would you first give us, for those who are younger, haven't read their history, a thumbnail sketch, what was McCarthyism?
Yeah, so McCarthyism, and I'd say the Red Scare broadly, was a period of fervent anti-communist hysteria following the end of the World War II, the onset of the Cold War, and really the dramatic changes that were going on in American society at that time. So while the country was trying to put the war behind it, trying to figure out how to manage this new global conflict with the Soviet Union, it was also turning inward and demonizing and hunting for people who could be tarred, could be labeled in some way radical, too far to the left. There was a national security reason for being concerned about espionage and subversion, and there was some of that to be found. But what McCarthyism was in particular was the appropriation of this concern for political ends. And really also the way that this sort of hunt, this fear took on a life of its own, so that people who in no way, shape, or form deserved scrutiny or punishment for their political beliefs suddenly became ostracized, punished, saw their lives turned upside down for no reason at all.
Yeah, I think you bring up an important point that there was some serious legitimate concerns. The Soviet Union was essentially taking over Eastern Europe at the time. They had developed an atomic bomb several years after we did. And Stalin was still in power for part of this time. So, yeah, there was concern, and yet, as you said, it was allowed to sort of metastasize into American culture. I should point out, just a few years before that, in the 1941, the United States government reacted after Pearl Harbor by imprisoning several hundred thousand Japanese American citizens, sort of painting them with a broad brush as well. So there was some fairly recent precedent. So maybe we should start with the man this is named after, Joseph McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin. Who was he, and how did he become such a, for a period of time, powerful and central figure in American life?
So Joseph McCarthy was a first-term senator from Wisconsin. He had won his initial race in 1946 by taking on first his Republican primary opponent and then a Democrat with a pretty aggressive campaign that stretched the truth, that was full of smears, and he had definitely had a battle plan. And yet, when he got to the Senate, he was relegated to the backbench. He wasn't considered a very effective senator. He made a lot of speeches, but no one listened. And it really wasn't until 1950 when he started to take up anti-communism and adamant anti-communism as a cause, that he started to get attention. Now, he wasn't the first to do this, and he wasn't the only person who had made this sort of their badge, but he brought a particular no holds barred approach, and no truth barred approach, if you will. He was willing to bend the truth, to lie, to attack people with no basis, and to not apologize when he was called out for saying things that were demonstrably untrue. He started off with a speech in, of all places, Wheeling, West Virginia, in early 1950, where he said essentially the State Department was riven with spies, that there were hundreds of communists inside the State Department. And he got on the front page. It became pretty much a constant over the next 4 years that McCarthy would be on the front page of newspapers almost every day with a new charge. And when it was proven pretty clearly that there were not hundreds of spies in the State Department, he moved on to other targets. And eventually he took on bigger and bigger targets. He was reelected in 1952 pretty handily. At one point, half of the country approved of what he was doing. And it gave him energy to go after George C. Marshall, who was Secretary of State, but had been really one of the great heroes of World War II. He went after President Eisenhower himself. He went after the Army. And, there's a certain Icarus quality to him. He got too big and went too high. But he did an enormous amount of damage during that time. And he really took the cause of anti-communism, which had, as I said, a kernel of truth to it and a validity and a real reason for concern. But he took that and erased any legitimacy at all. And I think in the end, ultimately undermined American national security.
So here was a man who, as you say, made almost daily or weekly pronouncements, which often had little or nothing to do with the actual truth. He never backed down, never apologized, moved on when it was proven to be untrue to the next sort of outlandish thing. He was always on the attack. Some might say this reminds them of a current president of the United States. There was some connective tissue here, and let's talk for a moment about Roy Cohn, who I think both McCarthy and Donald Trump have known. Who is Roy Cohn?
So when Roy Cohn first went to work for Joe McCarthy as his chief counsel, he had already made a name for himself as a sort of boy wonder prosecutor in New York City. He passed the bar exam before he was able to drink. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant lawyer, but he was also someone who, like McCarthy and President Trump, had a certain willingness to set aside moral constraints, to put it nicely. But he worked on some pretty big cases, most notably the prosecution of the Rosenbergs for nuclear espionage in 1951, 52. And so that brought him to the attention of McCarthy. There were a lot of people who, including some fairly deep-pocketed people who supported McCarthy, who liked Cohn and wanted to put them together. One of the things that Cohn did that was very important, up until 1952, where he joined in 1953, the staff. McCarthy had been kind of a one-man operation with a staff that was cobbled together. And in 1953, Cohn came in and he really gave structure to McCarthy's staff. And he brought in some of his own people. He took advantage of the people who were already there. A lot of ex-FBI people worked for McCarthy as investigators. And he sort of became the CEO of McCarthy Incorporated, if you will. He's, sort of put a little bit of method to the madness of McCarthyism, even as he drove McCarthy further. I think that a lot of the choices that McCarthy made in terms of going after President Eisenhower, going after the Army, those were choices that Cohn pushed McCarthy to make. Maybe he would have done it anyway, but Cohn was really in the driver's seat there. And he both learned from McCarthy and he helped push McCarthy. So when we talk about things like the political principle of attack, 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 that's something that both McCarthy and Cohn embraced and used very effectively for the better part of 2 years in the Senate. Eventually, McCarthy was, through a series of events in the Senate, he was censured, and pretty humiliated. Cohn, he was forced to fire Cohn. Cohn moved back to New York, went into private practice, and that's how, really 2 decades later, he ended up meeting Donald Trump.
The McCarthy basically took on some of the pillars of the establishment, as you mentioned, including George C. Marshall, who was probably the most respected man in America at one point, certainly in the military. He took on Harry Truman. He took on Dean Acheson, who was Truman's Secretary of State, and indirectly took on Eisenhower. How did the two presidents, Truman and Eisenhower, deal with McCarthy?
So I think one of the things that I found is really sort of interesting to me was, that as different as Eisenhower and Truman were, they came from different parties. Truman was a politician to his core. Eisenhower was a military man who got into politics late. They were very similar in a lot of ways. They were born very close to each other. They grew up in similar Midwestern, flinty, pragmatic families. And, they brought a certain pragmatism to the office. And also, I'd say, a certain naivete. They really had a belief that the American people were above the kind of mudslinging that McCarthy and others practiced, that eventually it would go away. And, Truman early on sort of didn't believe that the Red Scare would really take off. He believed that, Americans were just too sensible to be overtaken by mob mentalities. And, he was wrong. And I think he really regretted that. He wrote about that later in his memoirs. Now, Eisenhower was the same way. Eisenhower repeatedly refused to, as he said, get into the gutter with that guy. He despised McCarthy personally. He wanted nothing to do with him. But he really believed that McCarthy couldn't be a phenomenon, that McCarthy had a short political lifespan because he was appealing to this base sensibility that Eisenhower, like Truman, believed simply didn't exist in America, that Americans were too good-hearted and pragmatic to go along with it. And it was only after, well over a year and of McCarthy's increased attacks against not just Democrats, but against fellow Republicans and against institutions like the Army, Eisenhower finally said, well, okay, we have to put an end to this guy. This is not going to go away on its own.
One famous case that Richard Nixon was involved with involved Whittaker Chambers and Alger Hiss. It was a very strange case with two, frankly, very strange men. If you want to include Nixon, that's three strange men. But briefly, but it did become a prominent case, and it really helped Nixon's career. What was the Chambers Hiss thing about?
So The Chambers Hiss case, it remains one of the great political scandals in American history. It's fascinating to read about. Alger Hiss was one of the rising stars in certainly in the Democratic establishment, the foreign policy establishment. Everyone expected him to be Secretary of State someday, and he was serving as the president of the Carnegie Endowment. And when Whittaker Chambers, who was a journalist, worked up in New York, came forward with an accusation that Alger Hiss was a longtime communist, had been a member of the party, and that he was essentially lying to the American public. And this set off a series of high-profile congressional hearings in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, with Nixon very much in the middle of it. And, these were televised. Millions of Americans watched. It was on the front pages for months, and then well over a year, because ultimately Hiss sued Whittaker Chambers for libel, for slander, and Chambers then came back and said, well, not only was he a communist, but he was a spy. I was a spy, and that's how I know. And this landed just a bombshell, right? That the idea that not only an American, but such a high-placed American figure would be a spy. And Chambers had very good evidence that he was a spy. What was so fascinating for Americans watching was that Hiss seemed so believable. And he struck this figure that of the establishment that everyone was told to trust. And he completely denied everything. He said everything that Chambers is saying is a lie. And the federal government ended up prosecuting Hiss, and he was convicted of perjury because the actual things he was accused of, the espionage, had the statute of limitations had run out. So essentially, he was convicted of lying about being a spy, and he went to jail. But for the rest of his very long life, he insisted that he was completely innocent. And Chambers continued to insist that Hiss was absolutely guilty. And even to this day, there are people who defend Hiss and insist that everything Hiss was accused of was a lie. Most people, I'd say most historians who have gone back to examine the material, examine the evidence, have concluded that no, Chambers was telling the truth, that Hiss was completely guilty of everything he said, and that Hiss was lying. I think that's, in my assessment, that is the truth. But to me, it's less interesting, ultimately, who was telling the truth and who wasn't. What's more interesting is how this resonated with the American public, how the divide between those two men became really the defining divide during the Red Scare, that there were people who believed Hiss and believed that there was a giant conspiracy to destroy him and to destroy the left. There were the people who believed Chambers, who believed that, no, there was, in fact, a giant conspiracy by the Communist Party, by the Communist Party's allies, to undermine the United States. And that really came to, that chasm between those two beliefs really defined the Red was all about. And I'd say really, echoed for decades after. I think was a huge part of when we talk about modern partisanship, that story and that unwillingness on either side to believe in the nuances of the case or the nuances of the other side, I think echoes very clearly today.
And of course, this was a time when there was not cable TV, there was not internet, so people were getting their information pretty much centralized and yet still had this divergence. Another famous case from that era, which obviously McCarthy and Roy Cohn, who you mentioned, were involved with, was Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. Somewhat similar to the Chambers Hiss, where there was a lot of people in one camp and a lot of people in the other. Tell us briefly about the Rosenbergs.
Yeah, so in 1950, not long after McCarthy came to prominence, Julius Rosenberg, who was an engineer in New York City, was arrested by the FBI, and a few weeks later, his wife, Ethel, who was a homemaker, was arrested. They had two small children at home, and they were accused of an seemingly impossible thing, which is, here's this family, not very well off, living in Manhattan. They were guilty, or they were charged with, or he was charged with running a espionage ring for the Soviet Union that was responsible for stealing nuclear secrets and essentially giving the Soviets material to build, or the diagrams to build a nuclear weapon. And, this was not long after the Soviets tested their first nuclear weapon. So they were held responsible for potentially destroying the world in the rhetoric of the prosecutors, including Roy Cohn. Now, there were a lot of nuances to the case. I think ultimately it's pretty clear that Julius Rosenberg was guilty of espionage, was guilty of passing secrets to the Soviet Union, of running a network. There are more questions about the extent to which Ethel was involved. I don't think that her hands were clean, but it's hard to make the case that she was guilty of what her husband was accused of. Ultimately, they were both convicted, and in 1953, they were executed in the electric chair in New York State. And again, this is a case where, to me, there is I think, an important debate to be held about how guilty they were. Were they guilty of what they were charged of? I think there's still a lot of evidence that people can look to. Although, again, I think the preponderance of the evidence looks pretty bad for them. Were they guilty of high treason is probably a different question. But what was more interesting to me was, what did this case mean at the time? How did it play out? They became international cause celebs. In Europe, there were huge movements to protect the Rosenbergs. Here in the United States, there was a pretty energetic movement to get them pardoned, or at least their sentence commuted. That didn't happen, and there was also a huge backlash against that, one that was tinged with anti-Semitism. They were both Jewish. They came from the Jewish community in New York, and a lot of the animosity toward them was colored by anti-Jewish hate that was, hasn't gone away, but was quite prominent in early 1950s America. And it's hard to separate that from the drive to see them receive the ultimate punishment. The Rosenberg story ultimately is a story of divided perspectives. There were people who believed that they were guilty, and no nuance could separate that from the fact that they needed to be executed. That was basically what the judge said in that case. On the other hand, there were people who I think generally rightly said, look, this is a case that has a lot of details that are being washed over in the rush to punish, in the rush to execute these people. We are demonizing them and therefore doing a great injustice. And I think there's truth on both sides. And this is why I think this era is so difficult to understand dispassionately. It's very easy to fall into one side or the other and say everything is black and white. It wasn't black and white.
There were two people who were somewhat tangentially involved, two brothers, John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. We don't talk about them too extensively in the book, but the McCarthy era did affect their political careers in certain ways, and I think said a lot about each of them. Can you talk very briefly about their role, each of their roles?
Yeah, I think especially in the early 1950s, mid 1950s, during this era, they were, first of all, they were good family friends with McCarthy. They were like McCarthy. They were Catholic. They came from big family. What welcomed McCarthy into their home. He was a frequent guest at Kennedy family events, broadly Kennedy, not just Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy supported Nixon in his race very quietly. And while he didn't support McCarthy, he was very careful not to come out as anti-McCarthy during the height of McCarthyism. His brother Robert was more openly pro-McCarthy, I guess you'd say. He worked for McCarthy briefly, and he really wanted that chief counsel job. In fact, the only reason why he left and went to work on a different committee was because Roy Cohn beat him to the job. And, why he beat him, it's hard to say. Probably Roy Cohn was just more willing to be vicious and take the gloves off than even Bobby Kennedy was. But there was a point where Bobby Kennedy was very much in line with at least the goals of McCarthyism. And a lot of this changed over time. I think there is a certain amount of attack in Bobby Kennedy's life story. He changed, as we all know. He became someone different in the 1960s, more progressive, more thoughtful. His brother, I'd say, changed less. Jack Kennedy was always very careful about where he put his political chips. And, he was not someone who took enormous risks or really put himself out there in the way that his brother did. At heart, he was a moderate Democrat who went with the winds where it was necessary, but always kept a pretty trim sail. He loved sailing, so I can use that metaphor. But I think both of them ended up with a very complicated relationship with McCarthy and with McCarthyism. Their unwillingness to stand against it, I think, has to be read as part of the story. And when people glorify them as progressive heroes, they have to at least explain how they could embrace someone like McCarthy.
Interestingly, Robert Kennedy did attend Joseph McCarthy's funeral in Wisconsin, but did it very privately and asked reporters not to state that he was there. He came as a family friend. There was one very funny story. I mean, it's sort of sad funny in your book. I mean, McCarthy was an alcoholic, and following the censure in the Senate, he was drinking more heavily even before that, and then he really went downhill. He ultimately died of cirrhosis complications of the liver. But there's this funny story in the Soulgrave Club, which is a private dining club in Washington, where McCarthy was so angry at Drew Pearson, who wrote a sort of political gossip column, that McCarthy attacks Pearson in a bathroom at the Soulgrave Club, and in comes Richard Nixon, who is a Quaker. He said there to break them up. He literally physically separated the two men. It's bizarre.
Yeah, and he said, something to the effect of, leave it to a Quaker to break up this fight. I mean, I love that story because that's how Washington is. Maybe less so today, but certainly through the 20th century, these were not political figures who existed in their own little bubbles. They worked together, they drank together, they ate together. Even people who were on different sides, they belonged to the same clubs. DC was a lot smaller of a town back then. So, yeah, that's how someone like Drew Pearson made his ways. Was he was in these places and would see things going on. Knew it was fertile pickings. And yeah, so I think aside from just being, sort of a funny, sad story within the context of the Red Scare, it's also a story that just evokes a different era in Washington.
Well, it evokes a different era, and yet, to bring it back to the present, we hear from reports that many Republican senators, some congressmen and women, privately don't like President Trump, but are unwilling to vote for him. And we see the same in the McCarthy era. A lot of Republican senators thought McCarthy was a ludicrous and obnoxious jerk. And yet it took a long time for them to finally vote a censure and essentially end his career. So there are echoes of the past. The book is wonderful. You write it in almost a storytelling way. It was kind of gripping. You also transmit the fear that was present throughout society, that people were tattling on each other. It was almost like a communist state. The slightest deviance, and you could lose your job, you could lose everything. So I think that's one of the main things that comes through is that fear, and certainly I hope that we're not heading back in that direction. I want to talk for a few minutes about this book, which I said did come out a few years ago. It looks at really the immediate aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King, when a number of cities erupted in widespread rioting, and then the long-term effects of that. You look at several cities, my former hometown of Washington, D.C., prominently, also I think Chicago, New York City. Different mayors handled the situation in different ways. On the cover of your book is Robert Kennedy, who was a presidential candidate at that time, and the day after the riots walked through the ruins of downtown Washington, D.C. to be there, basically. What made you decide to write this book?
Well, this was the first book that I wrote, and I was living in D.C. at the time, and this was in the mid-2000s, and you could still see evidence of the violence after King's assassination. I was living not far from the intersection of U and 14th, where is sort of thought of as the starting point for the days of rioting that followed. And like I said, you could still see the evidence. It was disappearing under gentrification, and it was a story that I knew. My mother had lived in D.C. at the time. My father was in the Army at the time in Chicago or outside of Chicago. And so I knew these stories, and yet no one talked about it. There was nowhere to find out this history. You could go, as you said, to New York. There was a story to tell in New York. There's a story in Baltimore. Ultimately, more than 100 cities had some level of disorder. And so the response from the military, from the National Guard, from politicians was also enormous. And, this came in 1968, a pivotal year in American political, cultural history. And so I was fascinated by this. Here's this thing that was absolutely central, I think, to the change in course in American life that one can isolate and sort of identify in 1968, and yet there's really nothing about it. The King biographies sort of end with his assassination. They don't talk about it. Even political histories of 1968 didn't get into it. I was very proud of this book because so much of the research I did was in archives that had never been looked at. The military archives. The military had extensive files on this period. Political biography or political memoirs. I could still interview people who had worked in the White House at the time. They were still alive, and so it was a fresh story, and it was one that I was, as I said, very proud to tell.
Well, it reads again like you're a storyteller along with the historian, which makes it so interesting to read. 5 days before Martin Luther King was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson had announced that he was not going to run for re-election. There was a great surge of hope, at least within the White House, that this was going to, now that he wasn't running and didn't have to be fending off Robert Kennedy and others, that he would focus on hopefully moving toward an end to the Vietnam War, moving ahead with some of his urban issues. This, as you write, basically ended the Johnson presidency for all intents and purposes, because after that much of white America sort of shut down, that they sort of changed from supporting the civil rights movement to retreating to the suburbs and drawing up the gate, so to speak. When you write about it, you said the riots, and you, particularly in Washington, D.C., you write about it very vividly, how it started that night. And you say it was a mixture of deadly violence as well as, quote, a picnic. And it did bring to mind January 6, 2021 at the Capitol, where there does seem to have been that same mix of people who probably were intent on doing real harm, and others who just sort of went with the crowd. Do you sense any resonance there?
Well, that's interesting. I'd never really thought about it. I would say generally, in my understanding of the psychology of mob events, that there is always a mixture of anger and joy, and it's because fundamentally what a mob is the release of collective anxiety, collective frustration from out from under the authority, whatever the authority is at the moment. And so, people were angry at the assassination of Martin Luther King, but the violence in DC would not have happened had there not been months, years preceding that of everyday police harassment, police violence, everyday economic constraints, discrimination by store owners. People had a lot of things to be angry about. And so when this spark came along, and that's really what it was just a spark that set people off, suddenly all the rules went away and they felt unconstrained. And so there is a certain joy, right? There was an enormous amount of looting that went on. And I think something similar that you saw in the Capitol. There was, people taking souvenirs, with the photos and video of people, of the January 6th rioters, walking through the halls of Congress as if they owned it. And I think there probably was a certain amount of that, right? That they really did feel suddenly they were in control and they had the power, even if they knew it was fleeting. I think there's something very similar that happened after King's assassination. And I think you could probably find, the storming of the Bastille was probably the same way. I don't mean to be drawing all these tightly in comparison, but I think on the level of just the behavior of a mob, there are a lot of similarities across time.
And you talk about in your book that it was real tragedy, particularly for Washington, D.C., but Baltimore as well, and that the hardworking people struggling to get the middle class or in the middle class, particularly black people who are living in these communities were destroyed. They had no more businesses. They had no more, some of the city services disappeared. And it would be many, many, many years before any of that would come back. And when it has come back in many cities across the country, it's really come back through gentrification, where these distressed properties and abandoned properties are now taken up and are now sort of wealthy, high-end kind of stores, restaurants, homes.
Yeah. After the violence of 1968, middle class and upwardly mobile black families, they all moved to Prince George's County. They, just like any other, family with the resources to be mobile, didn't want to be in a place that had burned to the ground. This was both a white and a black experience, but of course it followed patterns of segregation. Prince George's County became, large sections of it became predominantly black or, enormous minority populations. Montgomery County to the northwest became much whiter and much more densely populated as people fled and really, reinforced patterns of segregation that the 1960s had tried to break down, including, ironically, in 1968, on the ironic, tragic impetus of King's assassination, the Fair Housing Act, which had been sort of struggling in Congress, suddenly got a moral wind and passed very quickly. It was the last major piece of civil rights legislation of that era. And it did great things to fight legal segregation, but there wasn't a lot that it could do, that anyone could do, to block patterns of just personal choice and economic change. And I think that really did a lot to set the pattern for American race relations and racial geography over the decade since. In
the remaining few minutes, I wanted to talk about your current work at the New York Times. You have been an opinion columnist, you've been a reporter, and one of your main assignments, it seems now, is to write the obituaries, which are very famous. I mean, they're probably the most prominent obituaries writings in the United States. What is it like to write obituaries for the New York Times?
People are always surprised when I say this, but it's an enormous joy. We write obituaries in a way. I mean, I think fundamentally an obituary is about a life. It's not about death. The death is just the pretext for writing what is essentially a small biography of someone. And sometimes it's someone very famous. Sometimes it's someone who should be famous. Sometimes it's someone who is obscure, but worth knowing about. And we do all sorts, and we really try to cover the range of the human experience. I've written everything from historians and politicians to, journalists and explorers and criminals and, all kinds of inventors. And every life has something fascinating to say. I mean, everyone has a story to tell. And our job is really to pull that out and to say, this is someone you might know because they wrote a book or because they were on TV. But here's their story in full. Here's who they were. And I do it just, like I would any other story. I interview people. I read, material about the subject. I spend a lot of time trying to craft a story that does them justice. And it is, I've been doing it for 6 years now, almost 5.5. And it's the best thing I've ever done.
Well, as I've said a couple of times during this interview, you are a storyteller. And obviously, you do your research, extensive research in both of these books, primary sources here. But at the heart, it sounds like you're a storyteller. And that's what makes these two books readable, as well as, I'm sure, your others, and the New York Times articles that you write. So I want to thank Clay Resnick for being here with us today. We really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to your next books.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. I really appreciate all those kind words, and I hope you like the next one.
Thank you. And please join us for the next episode of Meet the Author.